Welcome. Today I would like to talk about another brilliant achievement of Sota Fujii, who became the youngest 5 crown in Shogi history. So 5 crown means that he holds 5 of the major Shogi titles at the same time, and Fujii is only 19 years old. So brilliant in itself, but even more so that he managed to beat Akira Watanabe in this title match with a score of 4-0, so a complete whitewash again in one of these matches. And for me, it's really hard to see who should stop him from winning all the major titles, to be honest. So to honor this achievement, let's take a look at one of the games from the match. And this game was the second game of the Osho Title match. Watanabe played with Sente and Fujii played with Gote. The opening is a double static rook, and we soon reach bishop exchange. And we will see that the development from both sides is quite typical and quite symmetrical. So after a normal development by both sides, we reach a completely symmetrical position after 20 moves. And now, as we will see, they even continue to play in a symmetrical way for some more moves. So they interlock the pawns on the edges of the board. And now we have still a completely symmetrical position after 26 moves. So at this point, Watanabe decides to push his pawn on the 6th file, playing pawn to 6f. And Fujii decides to break the symmetry and now go for an attack with the silver, with his pawn push, pawn to 7e. Of course, eyeing to eventually push his pawn on the 8th file, who would then be supported by the silver. So after takes. Now Watanabe himself goes for the 2nd file. Yeah, it's a pretty typical way of playing, because each side plays on the flank where the rook is. So yeah, very standard. And now Watanabe goes for the 2nd file, as I said, and Fujii himself goes for the 8th file. After takes, we now see another typical motive by Fujii, who places his rook on 8d. Very nice square for the rook. On the one hand, the rook attacks or eyes the 8th file, and it also protects the d rank, or eyes also maybe a potential switch on the d rank to some square, like for instance 5d later in the game. Watanabe goes for the 2nd file, as we said, and Fujii, with a very standard motive, just defends this weak point on 2c. Yeah, and now here Watanabe reinforces his castle, so does Fujii. And Watanabe brings his knight, eyeing a potential attack with a knight on the silver on 3c. Fujii advances the silver, quite aggressive. It has the potential disadvantage of weakening the king, but he's not afraid of that. So, yeah. Watanabe continues with this bishop drop. For me, these moves are always the most difficult to find or to judge, when these kind of bishop drops are good and when not. But it makes some sense in this position, definitely, because Fujii has just pushed the silver, so thereby loosening this pawn on 3d. So now attacking this pawn makes quite some sense. And Fujii decides not to defend the pawn. So this is now a very long line, which he probably started to calculate at this point. So with this bishop drop, I think he has already seen the position which occurs 12 moves later. Yeah, so what happens now? Well, first, Watanabe kicks away the silver, which is in a quite nice position. So he plays rook to 2e, and now the silver has to go back. And Watanabe goes for the bishop takes pawn. Instead, probably just keeping a more symmetrical position with a move like rook to 2f would lead to a roughly equal position. But I think Watanabe thought that he might take advantage of this daring play by Fujii by taking this pawn, but in fact it backfires. So maybe you can also pause the video at this point and you can think about what the nice sequence is that Fujii has at his disposal here. Well, Fujii first played this pawn drop, so this might or might not be part of the sequence which you found, deflecting the gold. It's important to make these moves relatively early in the game if you want to make them, because at a later stage you might not have the time to take 2 pieces like that because your opponent is already attacking. But if you do them early, when the game is still not yet completely open, your opponent is basically forced to take these pawns, thereby weakening the castle. Okay, takes, and now the sequence that I was asking for is basically bishop takes, very nicely calculated by Fujii. And you might think, well, okay, if you take both of these pawns and you do this promotion, won't you lose the bishop after the silver move? Yeah, so the bishop has nowhere to go, everything is protected. But here is the idea which Fujii came up with, and maybe at this point you can see the idea as well. It's the move silver to 3e. So basically, instead of trying to remove the bishop, he just gives up the bishop but threatens the rook. And so no alternative was particularly nice for Watanabe at this point. So I think at this point, Watanabe is just worse, and the whole maneuver with bishop takes pawn backfired. So what could Watanabe do? Well, he could do what he did in the game, to just take the bishop, or he could take the silver, but I think this would not be advisable, because then Fujii could just take here, and say you put something here, and then maybe something like takes, and the pieces are quite loose, and you have a rook in hand on Fujii's side. So maybe even a motive like a rook drop, as we will see later in the game, could be nice. And here there's even an additional benefit maybe of dropping the knight here, which creates further attack on Watanabe's king. So this does not really work. So for that reason, in this position, Fujii decided to just take the promoted bishop instead of going for silver take silver, which would just lose the game. So clearly better what he did, to just take. And now Fujii won the rook. And of course, in these kind of open positions, if you have the rook against the bishop, it's a clear indication that Fujii is already much better at this point. Watanabe nonetheless tries to go for an attack on the king with his pawn drop. You can't take the pawn because the gold is hanging, so instead Fujii reinforces his castle. And now Watanabe himself tries a similar motive to what Fujii tried before, trying to deflect the defenders. But as I said before, now it's much later in the game, so the game becomes more concrete, and Fujii doesn't seem to be obliged to take this pawn anymore, which would weaken his castle, but instead goes for this rook drop. Quite an atypical motive, I would say, because if Watanabe had something like gold in hand, he could just place it next to the king and the rook would be lost. But of course, in this case, Watanabe doesn't have it, so he has to put this bishop in this very awkward spot on 6i. Fujii's play now is very forceful and very direct, just promoting one pawn and thereby opening up this side even more. And now after takes, he drops another pawn, attacking this knight. And again, you see this typical Fujii style, attacking from both sides at the same time against the king, which is in the middle, and not being afraid of sacrificing pawns. So in this case, if you don't want to lose the knight, you have to take the pawn. And now Fujii is just happy to take the lands. So he's now up material quite significantly. And the last problem he kind of has is that both of his rooks are not really that active. So after the gold move, he's forced to go back. And now this rook is not yet really in the game, and this rook only now threatens to come into the game with taking here on 6f. So to stop that, I think Watanabe already has to take quite drastic measures by what he did in the game, by just giving up the bishop. And now he dropped the gold, forcing the rook to move. And now both rooks of Fujii are not yet that active again. But still, of course, he's up quite a lot of material. So Watanabe tries to use this time to take a knight. But Fujii now very forcefully drops this lance and goes for a very concrete line with this lance drop, followed by this rook sacrifice. If you have such an open king, of course you have to calculate this quite accurately. I think there would have been other options which would also lead to an advantage, but I think Fujii just calculated everything here quite precisely, judging that there is not really a big attack on the king. Yeah, Watanabe just runs with the king. And now another very strong move by Fujii, a move which is easily missed, I guess. Such a knight drop to 3D, attacking the silver, which is kind of the last piece to hold everything together, because if the silver is gone, you can just take this knight and then continue with your attack. So yeah, for that reason, he tries to keep the silver, but now Fujii continues the attack. And yeah, Watanabe himself now also tries desperately to attack. But Fujii in this position goes for the finishing blow. I think there are also, again, more less direct ways of playing, but Fujii goes for the very direct gold takes pawn, just calculating the line until the end. And yeah, in the game now, Watanabe took this gold and just basically told Fujii, okay, show me how you will mate me. Other moves will prolong the game a bit more, but there's no question that Fujii is winning here. So after takes, now Fujii took the bishop. And yeah, so there are basically two lines which he has to calculate. One, if he takes back with the gold, which is what happened in the game. And two, what happens if he takes back with a king. So in this case, there is a very nice bishop drop, giving a check. So the king has to run. And now there is again a promotion. And after takes, there is a nice bishop drop to 4f, which now results in a mate. Why? Well, if you run backwards or something, there's the gold drop, which will be made in the next move. And if you run, let's say if you run here, then you get another gold in hand, and then you have two more gold drops, and the game is over. So it's basically a forced mate. So you cannot really take back with the king in this position. So instead you have to take back with the gold. And now Fujii again shows a similar motive by just taking. And now after the bishop drop, Watanabe resigned. And I mean, on the one hand, you can probably relatively safely take the silver in the next move, but I think it's probably even a mate. So for instance, if you go here, then Fujii could drop another bishop. And yeah, there are a lot of mating threats right now, so you can't go anywhere here because of a gold drop. So to defend against the gold drop, I guess you have to go somewhere like here. But then still there is the gold drop. And after this, yeah, there is probably quite a nice way to mate here. Just sacrificing both bishops. Takes, and the king is completely undefended. It will now succumb to this promoted rook, because now there's, of course, the threat of a gold drop. If you move the king, and if you don't move the king, but you put some piece in between, it doesn't really change, because you still have this gold drop. And after the king move, you can just take the gold, and it's a mate. So for that reason, in this position, Watanabe decided to resign and crown, and later Fujii was crowned the 5 crown and winner of the Osho title. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'm looking forward to more exciting games from Sota Fujii in the future.